Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
It gives me great pleasure to have this opportunity to introduce Eli Rosenbaum, this morning's speaker. He's the Director of Human Rights Enforcement Strategy and Policy within the Human Rights and Special Prosecutions Section, Criminal Division, United States Department of Justice. That mouthful doesn't tell us a lot about him, not nearly enough. Doesn't tell us about his extensive experience in investigating and prosecuting Nazi war criminals. This morning, we're about to learn a lot more. In his talk this morning, Eli is going to give us a behind-the-scenes look at one of the longest-running and highest-profile Nazi cases of the post-war era, that of former Cleveland auto worker John Demjanek. I finally mastered that pronunciation. I think I have that right. It's not easy. Eli spearheaded the remarkable Justice Department effort that resulted in Mr. Demjanek's deportation to Germany and his conviction there last year for complicity in some 28,000 murders. It's a number that's really hard to absorb. For his tireless work on this case, Eli won the Assistant Attorney General's Award for Human Rights Enforcement, the first and only award given of its type. I know you will leave here this morning enlightened, but also, I think, inspired by Eli's dedication to this very important work. So thank you, Eli.
Good morning. Thanks so much, Edith, for those very generous words of introduction. Like many other people, I thank you even more for your wonderful generosity in building the magnificent Everett Jewish Life Center here at Chautauqua. As I said in my opening remarks at Tuesday morning's program, the Everett Center, named at your initiative, of course, after your beloved husband Henry of blessed memory, is an extraordinary place that has already become, in just a few short years, a truly essential part of the very rich fabric of community life here at Chautauqua. It's been a particular joy to witness the development of a strong cooperative relationship between the Everett Jewish Life Center and the Robert H. Jackson Center, most notably in connection with the Jackson Center's annual summertime week-long special studies program at Chautauqua. Both centers are devoted to preserving unique legacies. One, the historical, religious, and cultural legacy of a great and ancient people. The other, the jurisprudential, humanitarian, political, and historical legacy of a great individual, a towering figure in American and world history, former Attorney General, boss of my agency, former Supreme Court Justice, and former Nuremberg International Chief Prosecutor Robert H. Jackson. That growing partnership is a manifestly appropriate one for many reasons, not the least of which is the fact that the legacies that the Everett Jewish Life Center and the Robert H. Jackson Center represent, preserve, and teach are constructed on an essential foundation of justice. From Hillel's golden rule that instructs us how we are to treat our neighbors, to the injunction in Deuteronomy, justice shall ye pursue, the concept of fairness, of elemental justice has been at the heart of Jewish belief, tradition, hope, and aspiration since the days of antiquity. And of course, Robert H. Jackson's celebrated lifelong, indefatigable quest for justice on behalf of all people, and most famously on behalf of African Americans, and at Nuremberg on behalf of Jewish and other victims of Nazi inhumanity, virtually defined his life and made him, without question, and on a bipartisan basis, the most revered American jurist of the entire 20th century. Someone whose legendary commitment to deciding cases on their legal merits rather than on the basis of ideology or political preference has obvious implications for current public discourse on the state of judging in this country. Further, I say it not on that subject. But perhaps not coincidentally, both of these two extraordinary centers have, since their inception, benefited from the generosity and vision of Edith Everett. So I think that the growing bond between the Everett Center and the Jackson Center is, to use a marvelous Yiddish word here in Hurlburt Church, beschert, roughly translated as meant to be. I've been asked to address this morning the case of John Demjanek, the one-time Cleveland area auto worker, and before that, Nazi death camp and concentration camp guard. Demjanek's case, as Edith said, has been one of the longest-running and most highly publicized legal sagas in history. Demjanek litigation of one sort or another has been before the courts in the United States, Israel, and Germany almost continuously for fully 35 years, since way back in 1977, yes, since the disco era. Demjanek died this past March in January, about 10 months after being convicted in Munich of serving as an accessory in the wartime murders, as Edith mentioned, of some 28,000 Jewish men, women, and children perpetrated at the infamous Sobibor death camp in Nazi-occupied Poland. Now, there are always quite a few Clevelanders summering at Chautauqua, and I know that this case has, for obvious reasons, been of particular interest to them. I'd wager that we have some current and former Clevelanders in the audience this morning, do we? No, there are the hands. Okay, great. Unfortunately, John Demjanek's supporters have spent nearly the entirety of the past 35 years aggressively promoting the demonstrably ludicrous notion that John Demjanek did not, in fact, serve the Nazi SS, and that he's been a victim of, variously, KGB frame-up, mistaken identity, and most recently, get this, identity theft by a long-deceased relative who, it is said, had the same name as he did. 3 decades of aggressive propagandizing by Demjanek's supporters, some of whom, like Pat Buchanan, have had prominent voices on the American scene, have in some respects overwhelmed, in the so-called court of public opinion, the quiet and methodical work that prosecutors have done in assembling the evidence, presenting it in courts of law, and successfully proving in those courts of law the essential facts of John Demjanek's wartime participation in Nazi genocide. Despite the fact that every court here in Germany and in Israel that has ever considered the facts of John Demjanek's case on the merits has found that his denials of service to the Nazis were patently false, that he was a shameless perjurer, and that, yes, he served as a Nazi death camp guard. Despite all that, people still sometimes say to me, "So tell me, Eli, was John Demjanek really what you say he was? Was he really a Nazi camp guard?" So what I'd like to do this morning is cut through the smoke and mirrors thrown up by Demjanek supporters and give you an overview of the evidence and the rather convoluted history of this unique case. But a few caveats are in order at the outset. First, time permits only a cursory presentation. It's simply not possible to comprehensively review 3 decades of litigation in just an hour, much less to present as well all of the voluminous evidence. Also, the evidence consisted, most importantly, of captured Nazi wartime documents that named Demjanek by name, documents that my office found in 4 different countries, archives in 4 different countries: the former Soviet Union, the former West Germany, post-Soviet Ukraine, and post-Soviet Lithuania. And those documents are in turn corroborated by documents that bear Demjanek's name and that were found in U.S. federal archives, that is, here in this country. Showing all those documents on the small screen here on the stage really wouldn't be of any use to the audience, as you really wouldn't be able to see the print, which in almost every instance presents foreign language text anyway. Accordingly, I'll just show a few of the key documents, I think 2 or 3, and I'll offer a sense of what the remaining documents show. Of course, anyone who's interested in the whole story can get a full accounting of the evidence by reading the briefs that we've filed over the years with courts and reading the decisions that federal court judges have issued. Those are online. Finally, before we begin the John Demjanek story, a few background facts. I apologize, some of these will be known to many of you. First, although Nazi Germany constructed literally thousands of camps and ghettos, and although Jews were killed in all of the camps to which they were sent, the Third Reich built just five actual extermination camps, what prosecutors and historians consider to be extermination camps, as distinguished from, say, concentration camps, slave labor camps, work camps. That is to say, camps that were devoted solely to murdering Jews, rather than, as in so many other camps, enslaving those Jews with the goal of their eventual demise. Those 5 camps were Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Helno, and Birkenau. Birkenau, of course, part of the Auschwitz complex. All of them constructed in Nazi-occupied Poland. These 5 names are, or at least should be, among the most infamous words in your human history. Everyone should know them. Second caveat, although both Germany and Israel can prosecute Nazi criminals, as can other countries in Europe, can prosecute Nazi criminals for their wartime crimes, the United States possesses only civil jurisdiction in the Nazi cases. The U.S. Justice Department can bring a denaturalization case in federal district court to revoke the naturalized U.S. citizenship of a Nazi criminal who obtained it illegally or through fraud. And then, if we prevail in court and if we survive what inevitably are years and years of appeals by the defendant, and if the defendant is still alive, we can then bring a deportation case in U.S. immigration court with the goal of effecting the Nazi criminal's removal, preferably to a country like Germany that possesses the criminal jurisdiction that we lack, so that the person can be prosecuted in another jurisdiction. As you can tell, this process takes years and years and years. Anyone with modestly capable counsel, I'm talking about a superstar like Greg Peterson, but your average lawyer should be able to delay this easily 5 to 10 years or more. And since everyone we prosecuted from the beginning was already a senior citizen, defense counsel knows that delay is the name of the game, the goal being have your client die in freedom in the United States. So as you'll see, these cases can really drag on. On regrettably infrequent occasions, foreign governments have requested the extradition of Nazi criminals in this country to stand trial in their countries. Of the 107 cases that we won in this country, in less than 10 instances did foreign governments request extradition. But extradition, as you know, is a court procedure that permits the comparatively expeditious transfer of a wanted person to stand trial in a foreign country. At various times over the decades, as I'll recount, Demjanek found himself in each of these categories of court action. Denaturalization, again, that's citizenship revocation, deportation, extradition, and also criminal trial overseas. Final point. Although Demjanek's defenders have often tried to persuade the public that U.S. Justice Department prosecutors proved their cases against him only under the low civil case standard of preponderance of the evidence, the so-called 51% burden of proof, rather than under the strict beyond a reasonable doubt standard that applies in criminal cases. In fact, the standards in denaturalization litigation and criminal cases are, according to long-established Supreme Court precedent, substantially identical. That's what the Supreme Court said, substantially identical. Very last thing. I'm going to do my best with the PowerPoint slides. I'm not sure I'm going to be totally coordinated on that, and we may have an issue as to whether the videos that I've embedded in the PowerPoint are going to play directly off the PowerPoint. I'd like you to see them. They're short, so we might have to stop the PowerPoint, go out of that folder, pull up the videos. We'll see. So let us move now then to the facts of Demjanek's story. Ivan Demjanek was born in Duk Makarenzi in central Soviet Ukraine to Nikolai and Yuliana Demjanek on April 3, 1920. This has never been in dispute. As a young man, he earned the trust of the local Soviet communist authorities, who promoted him to a position that was much exalted in rural areas before the war in the Soviet communist system. And you have to understand, the collectivization in the Soviet Union and the way they lionized farmers who produced, to understand that by being promoted to tractorist, tractor operator, he was in an exalted position and obviously quite trusted. After Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, Demjanek fought for his country in the Soviet army. He was wounded in the back by shrapnel, which left a scar. Demjanek was captured by German forces in May 1942 in the Battle of Kirch, and he was sent to a POW camp. Now, those are pretty much all of the major facts about his World War II past that Demjanek and his prosecutors have ever agreed upon. Demjanek insisted throughout his legal battles over 3 decades that he remained a prisoner of war for a long time, and that he eventually served in a German-sponsored Ukrainian combat unit that fought against the Soviets. Obviously, however, we proved in court a very different post-capture chronology in which Demjanek's service to the SS as a guard at Nazi camps figured most prominently, a service that Demjanek steadfastly denied until the day he died. Well, at war's end, we'll return to the war obviously, at war's end, Demjanek was hugely fortunate to find himself in the US occupation zone of Germany, not the Soviet zone. In the early 1950s, he applied for visas for himself and his new family to come to America. In 1952, Ivan Demjanek and his family immigrated to the United States of America. Here is his 1951 U.S. visa photograph. They settled in the Cleveland area, and Ivan, who became John Demjanek, found employment as a Ford Motor Company assembly line worker. He became a U.S. citizen in 1958. Thanks to successful negotiations and occasionally strikes by the United Auto Workers Union, Demjanek soon was earning a good middle-class income. He purchased a home and was truly living the American dream. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Demjanek, authorities in the USSR had been searching for him since the early post-war years. Soviet forces had captured an identity document issued during the war at the SS-operated Trebniki training camp in Nazi-occupied Poland. As you can see, it bore Demjanek's photo, his name, date, and I think it may have said place of birth, but certainly date of birth, and other identifying information. It even referenced the scar on his back, and it assigned to him a unique Trebniki guard number, 1393. What was the Trebniki camp? Well, it was nothing less than a school for mass murder. It was where the SS-trained men, most of whom were, like Demjanek, former POWs, who had served in the Soviet army. It trained them to help operate and guard Nazi death camps and slave labor camps, to participate in roundups of Jews, and to take part in mass shootings of Jews. Those of you who were here on Tuesday will remember that I spoke of an interview that I conducted of a former so-called Trebniki man, Jacob Reimer, whom we found in Carmel, New York, and Mr. Reimer admitted training at Trebniki, admitted leading a platoon of men on what he called a mission to liquidate a Jewish labor camp. The Nazis even constructed a Jewish labor camp adjacent to the Trebniki training camp so that the Trebniki guards would have Jews to practice on. Chillingly, the Trebniki identification card captured by the Soviets showed that Demjanek had been assigned from that camp to the Sobibor extermination camp. There's a handwritten entry that says Sobibor. Sobibor was truly a hell on earth, where perhaps 200,000 Jews were murdered, mostly having been gassed to death. The Soviets also captured a number of the former Soviet so-called Trebniki men, and some of them, under questioning, spoke of an Ivan Demjanek with whom they had served during the war. One of those men, for example, Ignaz Donalchenko, identified Ivan Demjanek as someone with whom he had served as a guard at the Sobibor extermination camp. The camp had been a place, he said, in which Jews were murdered en masse, and Demjanek, he said, like himself, had been part of that machinery of annihilation. Donalchenko added, curiously, that he had encountered Demjanek again late in the war when the two men served together, he said, as guards at the Flossenburg Nazi concentration camp, not in Poland, but in Germany. Well, Soviet authorities tried to find Demjanek, to no avail. He had simply vanished. For all they knew, perhaps he had died in combat, perhaps he was hiding under an assumed name, even in Ukraine, or perhaps he was living elsewhere in Europe or beyond. Of course, although the Soviets didn't know it, he was in fact in Western Germany and would soon immigrate to the United States. In Germany, as residential records maintained by West German authorities reflect, he was sharing an apartment after the war with a fellow Ukrainian, one Alexander Nagorny. I ask you to remember that name, Alexander Nagorny. By the mid-1970s, Soviet authorities at last traced Demjanek's whereabouts. He was alive, they discovered, in the Cleveland, Ohio area. Demjanek's defenders have asserted that Moscow learned of Demjanek's fate and his whereabouts because he made the mistake of writing to his mother back in Soviet Ukraine, and they think the Soviets, intercepted that correspondence. Or they say it's because Demjanek's wife, Vera, visited her mother-in-law in Ukraine. Which of these two versions, if either, is true, I don't know. In any event, by 1976, the Soviets made information on John Demjanek available to the editor of a pro-communist Ukrainian language newspaper published in New York City, including sharing the fact that Demjanek had served at the Nazi SS at the Sobibor extermination camp and was living in Ohio. The editor, in turn, relayed this information to U.S. authorities. I think it may have been through one or another U.S. senator, but in any event, it got to the government. And he also published the information in his newspaper. Around the same time period, the Soviets published the information in their own propaganda newspapers, complete with a photographic reproduction of this Travnicki-issued identity card for John Demjanek. They also published excerpts from the 1949 testimony of former Sobibor guard Ignaz Donalchenko, in which he recalled his service with fellow guard Ivan Demjanek at Sobibor and later at the Flossenburg camp. The then U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS for short, soon launched an investigation. They arranged interviews of some of the few Jews who had managed to survive Sobibor. Well, under 100 Jews did so, but none of them identified Demjanek. That failure isn't entirely surprising, after all, because, well, the Travnicki guards at Nazi camps didn't wear ID badges to tell the prisoners who they were. The photo of Demjanek that was shown to Sobibor survivors was the photo you saw before, his U.S. visa photo, which had been taken years after World War II ended, so his appearance had obviously changed, and it didn't depict him the way the prisoners might have seen a guard, of course, in uniform. However, to the surprise of INS investigators, survivors of the Treblinka death camp, kind of the mirror image of Sobibor, but with a much higher death toll, survivors of the Treblinka death camp extermination, who were shown a so-called photo spread of black and white photos that included Demjanek's photo as filler, a photo spread that had been assembled in the hope that some of the Treblinka survivors would recognize a man named Fyodor Fedorenko, and admitted a confessed Treblinka guard who was living in, of all places, Miami Beach, Florida. Survivors of Treblinka began to identify also Demjanek's photo, and they said that man they remembered very well. He was a vicious Ukrainian guard. They had had the great misfortune to encounter at Treblinka, where they said he was known as Ivan Grozny, Polish for Ivan the Terrible, a moniker he was given because he was one of the two notorious gas chamber operators there. One was Ivan, one was Nikolai, and was notorious for stabbing and cutting Jewish inmates and subjecting them to other horrible abuses as they were being herded into the gas chambers for execution. The possibility that Demjanek served at Treblinka was plausible to the INS investigative personnel. After all, the Trebniki training camp was the principal source of guards for Treblinka, just as it was for Sobibor. They had this document from the Soviet Union showing that Demjanek had been trained at Trebniki. And the Treblinka and Sobibor extermination camps were in the same region of Poland. The INS investigators must have been completely flabbergasted when they retrieved Demjanek's U.S. immigration file from agency storage. By the way, this is a close-up of the photo from the wartime card. Anyway, they retrieved his immigration file and found that on his 1951 U.S. visa application, Demjanek, like all would-be immigrants, had been required to identify his places of previous residence. His answer to that question included the assertion, remarkable to say the least, that he had resided from 1934 to 1943 at, quote, Sobibor, Poland. Unfortunately, that word Sobibor, which as I have argued should be one of the most infamous words everywhere on this planet, meant nothing to the U.S. officials who processed Demjanek for immigration to the country in the early 1950s, and he was approved for a visa. I dare say that if we took a survey of Americans today, despite all the Holocaust education that's taken place in this country, and didn't tell them why we were asking, just said, what's Sobibor, or even what Sobibor, Poland mean to you? 99-point-something% of the American public will go, I don't know. And as a Jew, I feel I can safely say that the vast majority of Jews, if you didn't give them some hint that it was Holocaust related, would have the same answer. It was a virtual impossibility that the appearance of the words Sobibor, Poland on Demjanek's immigration papers was an innocent coincidence. I'm going to show you now the visa application enlarging the Sobibor, Poland part. I don't know if you can probably read that. I have always said, if you allow me only one document in this case, I'll take that one, thank you. That's one. That's the one hardly anyone has ever seen, though we've been using it in litigation for over 30 years. That's as impossible a coincidence as would be the following. November 22, 1963. I'm called in for questioning about you-know-what that happened that day. And they say, Rosenbaum, you're not from Texas. What are you doing down there? Now, you're right, I'm from New York. You ever been in Texas before? No, it's my first time. You weren't just in Texas, right? You were in Dallas, is that right? Yes, sir, I was. And you weren't just in Dallas that day. You were in Dealey Plaza, weren't you? Yes, sir, I was. And you weren't just in Dealey Plaza. You were in the Texas School Book Depository there, weren't you? Yes, I was. And you were on a certain floor? Yeah, I was. And you had a rifle with you. Well, sure, I carry a rifle sometimes, and, I was just cleaning it. It's just an impossible coincidence, of course. It's particularly an impossible coincidence when you consider the fact that Sobibor was a tiny place with a 1943 population, according to an official German census that helpfully was taken that very year, of just 3,000 people. Of course, not including the scores of thousands of Jews who, quote-unquote, lived there for a few minutes on their way to heaven. There was nothing of significance going on in that little village except for the operation of a huge death factory. Now, why would a Ukrainian also be so far away from home in another country and in a village so small and obscure that most detailed maps of Poland then, as now, don't even include it? If post-World War II Cold War tensions hadn't long since brought an end to U.S.-Soviet cooperation in checking the pasts of would-be immigrants, in vetting would-be immigrants, a U.S. name check request to the Soviets, who were, after all, looking for Demjanek, would presumably have uncovered Demjanek's deception, prevented him from receiving a U.S. visa, and perhaps even resulted in his trial in Germany or somewhere else. Instead, he quite literally sailed into the United States. Well, heading back to the mid-1970s, the U.S. Immigration Service's Cleveland office took the results of its investigation to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Cleveland, the regional prosecution arm of the U.S. Department of Justice. On August 25, 1977, the U.S. Attorney's Office filed a denaturalization case against Demjanek in federal district court in Cleveland. The government's complaint filed with the court alleged that Demjanek was, in fact, Treblinka's notorious Ivan the Terrible. Even though the captured Trebnicki ID card showed a Demjanek assignment to Sobibor, didn't mention Treblinka, and even though Demjanek had stated on his post-war U.S. visa application and other immigration documents that he had lived during the war into 1943 at Sobibor, Poland, no mention was made in the government's complaint of Demjanek having served at Sobibor, or for that matter, having served at Trebnicki or any other Nazi camp. Instead, prosecutors relied on the Trebnicki ID card as proving that Demjanek had been based at that camp that provided the bulk of the guard force for Treblinka, and they based their Treblinka case, per se, on the fact that several survivors of Treblinka in several countries had picked out that post-war visa photo of Demjanek and identified it as showing the man whom they remembered as the ghastly Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible. The case was strengthened by the fact that, under questioning, Demjanek admitted that he had been given a blood group tattoo under his left bicep, a practice common to the SS, and that, yes, he had a scar on his back, just as the Trebnicki SS card stated. And his credibility was further undercut by the fact that it was undercut by the fact that he couldn't provide an accounting of his wartime years that came even close to being consistent with historically verifiable fact. Indeed, during the ensuing 3+ decades, Demjanek's credibility continued to be undermined by the fact that he consistently provided historically impossible accounts of his wartime whereabouts and activities in legal proceedings here and abroad. His credibility was further weakened by his assertion that, yes, he had indeed lied to U.S. authorities on his visa application in order to win approval to immigrate to the USA. What was the lie that Demjanek admitted to? You guessed it. He said that he had falsely listed Sobibor, Poland, as a wartime residence. Now he said, in truth, of course, he had never been in that town in his entire life. And he offered the first in a series of implausible and, in any event, mutually contradictory stories that he would adopt over years of litigation to explain the appearance of the damning word Sobibor on his post-war immigration papers. Oh, he said, I was online being processed for immigration, and I said to someone, where should I say I was during the war? And I don't know, maybe Woody Allen was online with him and gave him the answer, Sobibor, Poland. So he said, I gave that answer. And another time he said, well, I was online and there was a map of Poland, and I saw, I just randomly picked a place in Poland, happened to be Sobibor. Well, I say, good luck finding that on a map. And then there was another explanation. I actually said Sambor, S-A-M-B-O-R, Sambor, Poland, but they took it down as Sobibor. Of course, that doesn't explain how they took that down in different offices as Sobibor. In any event, in 1979, before that first case could go to trial, the Justice Department created a new unit, the Office of Special Investigations, or OSI, specifically to track down, investigate, and where appropriate, where the evidence warranted, take legal action to denaturalize and deport suspected Nazi criminals. I showed up there that summer of '79 as the office's first summer law intern, and I returned the following year after graduating law school to serve on the full-time staff as a young federal prosecutor. OSI, through its creation, automatically became the Cleveland U.S. Attorney's Office's partner in the Demjanek citizenship revocation case. Before the case went to trial, OSI, after examining the evidence, recommended that the government's complaint be amended to add the allegations that Demjanek had also served the SS at the Sobibor extermination camp, and at the Trebniki SS training and base camp. An amended complaint was duly prepared and filed with the Federal District Court in Cleveland. We also took Demjanek's pretrial testimony in a deposition. And in that sworn testimony, Demjanek repeated his denials of Nazi Guard service. And we asked him if there was any reason why the Soviet government would unfairly target him. After all, a virtually unknown assembly line worker. He said he did not. He added that he had never spoken out against the Soviet Union, and nor had he ever belonged to an anti-Soviet organization. A sensational trial was soon held in Cleveland. In February, March 1981, the Treblinka survivors came to the United States, courageously reopened these psychic wounds that can never really heal, and recounted their ghastly sufferings in Treblinka. And they identified Demjanek as the monstrous Ivan the Terrible. The U.S. prosecution team did not emphasize the Soviet War part of the case, nor did they seek to offer the testimony of Ignat Stalichenko, who was still alive in the Soviet Union. Although the original Trebniki card flown in from the Soviet Union for the trial had passed forensic testing by a U.S. government expert, and Demjanek's defense had declined our invitation to have a defense expert examine the card, Demjanek's defense was that the card was a Soviet forgery and that the survivors were simply mistaken. Large demonstrations, and the Clevelanders will remember this, organized by the Ukrainian community were held outside the courthouse, blasting the Justice Department for offering in evidence a document, the so-called Trebniki card, that came from Soviet files. And they echoed loudly Demjanek's claim that he was a victim of the KGB, the so-called KGB defense. In June 1981, Chief Judge Frank Battisti issued his decision. He found that Demjanek was indeed Treblinka's infamous Ivan the Terrible, and that he had concealed his Treblinka SS service when he immigrated to the United States. As a Treblinka guard, the judge ruled he had necessarily taken part in Nazi-sponsored persecution. That's the only thing that was going on in Treblinka as in Soviet War, and that therefore he had been ineligible to immigrate to this country. Demjanek's subsequent grant of U.S. citizenship had accordingly been illegally procured, and the court ordered that citizenship, Demjanek's citizenship, be revoked. As to the other allegations, particularly that of Soviet War service, the court ruled that it was unnecessary to decide those allegations because the Treblinka proof alone was sufficient to decide the case. That would have serious ramifications later on. In 1984, following the litigation of Demjanek's unsuccessful appeals, the Justice Department commenced deportation proceedings in U.S. Immigration Court in Cleveland. At that trial, one of Demjanek's defense witnesses was Cleveland travel agent Jerome Brentar, a longtime defender of Nazi criminals and at that point, soon-to-be prominent Holocaust denier. In fact, at Demjanek's deportation trial, he blurted out on the witness stand, not in response to any question, he blurted out that Treblinka wasn't a death camp. It was some sort of a transit camp. It wasn't even a death preparatory camp, he said. Of course, as Demjanek was in the room when he said that, so was Demjanek's counsel. Didn't stop them from working very closely with Jerome Brentar over the following years, though they would later say in litigation against Brentar that as soon as we learned what he was, we of course broke off our relationship with him. Baloney, as we say in New York. That is, New York City. Brentar also testified about having brought one of Demjanek's defense lawyers to Germany to meet with a major Nazi war criminal, Kurt Franz, a former senior SS official at Treblinka who was serving a life sentence in a German jail, but was allowed to have home leaves. After one of those meetings, Brentar wrote a lovely letter to Kurt Franz, and I'm just going to read you a little piece of it. It's in German. Brentar spoke that fluently. And it closes, our meeting will forever remain in my repertoire of pleasant experiences. I can say the same for the two gentlemen with me who commented that they never thought German people could be such nice people. Brentar also tried to get a former German soldier whose unit had passed through Treblinka to acknowledge that Treblinka was not, in fact, a murder facility, but rather had been only a transit camp. A journalist obtained a copy of their correspondence and made it available. The soldier's response to Brentar was stunning. He basically said, "Mr. Brentar, you don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, I saw Treblinka as a soldier, briefly, with my own eyes, and it was terrible. It was a human slaughterhouse for Jews." After the immigration hearing concluded, Immigration Judge Adolf Angelilli adjudged Demjanek deportable as a former Treblinka guard because he had never been admissible to this country in the first place. The judge ordered Demjanek deported to his native country, the Soviet Union, which also turned out to be, at that time, the only country in the world that was willing to accept him. Demjanek would, in fact, soon have been deported to the USSR, almost certainly to be tried, convicted, and executed there, but for the fact that Israeli prosecutors developed an interest in his case, obtained our evidence, and they decided to charge him and request his extradition to stand trial in Israel. They, as I say, indicted Demjanek on the Ivan the Terrible Treblinka charges, not on Sobibor charges, and they requested his extradition from the United States. At that point, Demjanek's deportation appeal was in effect suspended, and the extradition request was given priority by the court system. The court in Cleveland ruled that Demjanek was indeed extraditable to Israel, and on February 27, 1986, Demjanek was flown to Israel and arrested there, awaiting trial. He was tried in a Jerusalem courtroom starting in November 1986. The trial, as you'll remember, received worldwide saturation media coverage. Again, the Treblinka survivors identified him as Ivan the Terrible. Again, the documentary evidence, the Travnicki card and the U.S. immigration papers were placed in evidence by prosecutors and credited by the court. Demjanek again denied service at any Nazi camp, including Treblinka and Sobibor. No doubt, to Demjanek's great relief, the Israelis had no hope of calling his wartime camp guard buddy, Ignaz Donalchenko, to testify, because Donalchenko had died in the Soviet Union the previous year, 1985. Demjanek continued to cling to his precious KGB defense, arguing again that the Travnicki ID card was a Soviet forgery. That contention was seriously weakened, the strength of it was seriously weakened, when the prosecution in Israel offered proof that Demjanek's key expert forensic witness, a US-based document testing expert, had spoken at a professional convention of document analysts in the United States just a few months earlier, and had told his colleagues that, after extensive testing of the card, he could find absolutely no evidence of forgery. That was Demjanek's own expert. In 1988, the Jerusalem District Court's three-judge panel issued its decision convicting Demjanek as Ivan the Terrible based on the survivor identifications. The court found that he also had killed Jews as a Sobibor guard, but since he hadn't been charged with or extradited for Sobibor service, that finding wasn't a basis for the conviction itself as a matter of law. The court imposed the death penalty, a sentence that had been issued only once before in Israeli history, to the notorious Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann in 1962. In about 1990, as Demjanek's appeals were underway, actually really 1991, are underway in Israel, something that no one probably would have expected a short time earlier happens. The Soviet Union collapses. Communist rule in Eastern and Central Europe is dissolved. Well, now what happened? Evidence emerged from archives in the former Soviet Union, strongly suggesting the possibility that another Ivan, named Ivan Marchenko, also from Ukraine, was the Treblinka gas chamber operator known to the inmates as Ivan the Terrible. Demjanek's Israeli lawyer offered this evidence to Israel's Supreme Court. In August 1991, as the case was unraveling in Israel, the Demjanek Case, an OSI official, acting on a hunch that no prosecutors or investigators had ever comprehensively examined surviving SS documents from the Flossenburg concentration camp, which, as you'll recall, is the camp in Germany in which Sobibor guard Ignaz Donalchenko told Soviet authorities he had served with fellow Sobibor guard Ivan Demjanek late in the war. To his astonishment, my colleague found a 1944 document that came from a West German, not communist, a West German federal archive, showing that a guard whose name had been transliterated by the Germans from Ukrainian Cyrillic at that point as Demjanek, but who bore Trebniki number 1393, the same unique Trebniki number from the identity card issued at Trebniki, that this Demjanek 1393 was serving at that camp at Flossenburg in October 1944. This one-page SS document, and let me show it to you. I have to skip ahead. Let me interrupt myself and tell you. That's Jerome Brentar, about whom we heard. There's Kurt Franz during the war. We'll get back to him. There's Demjanek in Israel. Here's that one-page document. There's no chance that you're reading it on the screen. In fact, if you had it in front of you, it would be difficult to read because it was created on onion skin paper, very thin paper, and due to a paper shortage, the Germans typed on both sides of the page. And so when it was photocopied for us, and the light of the photocopy machine went through it, it copied the front and then in reverse the back on the same page. So on that piece of paper, you've got two texts superimposed, one backwards. My colleague, I think, got a bad headache trying to read through it, and he needed a magnifying glass. But eventually he found Demjanek. And then he found the same page, the same document, shows a Sobibor guard named Donalchenko, with Donalchenko's Trebniki number, serving there at the same time. So it was proof that Donalchenko had been telling the truth, Western proof, that Donalchenko had been telling the truth, that he had served with Demjanek at Flossenburg late in the war. Western proof. KGB defense should go out the window now. In July 1993, the Israeli Supreme Court reversed Demjanek's Treblinka, Ivan the Terrible conviction and ordered him released on the basis that the new evidence from the Soviet Union cast doubt on the Treblinka finding. The court declined to permit retrial of the case as a Sobibor prosecution, and Demjanek was released. In September 1993, accompanied by former Ohio Congressman Jim Traficant, there they are, Demjanek returned to the United States. Later that year, the U.S. Court of Appeals in Cincinnati ruled that U.S. prosecutors had improperly withheld evidence from Demjanek's defense lawyers. Although that three-judge panel did not reject the finding of a federal judge it had appointed to look into the case, that U.S. prosecutors had acted in good faith at all times, the Court of Appeals rejected that judge's findings that the prosecutors hadn't acted recklessly either. The Court of Appeals ruled that the prosecutors in this country had in fact acted recklessly, and through that recklessness had deprived Demjanek of fair legal proceeding in the United States. Chief District Court Judge Paul Mattia in Cleveland subsequently restored Demjanek's U.S. citizenship on the basis of the evidence that hadn't been shared with the defense, but he ruled in the same ruling that the Justice Department could reinstate denaturalization proceedings if it possesses, quote, a credible case. I had by now, late 1990s, been elevated to the position of Director of the Office of Special Investigations, something that as a one-time intern I never could have imagined. And although I had no meaningful involvement in the prior legal cases in the United States against Demjanek, I had now inherited the matter. They say that the meek shall inherit the earth. I inherited something else. I ordered a top-to-bottom reinvestigation of the case, which had by then, frankly, become a major embarrassment for OSI, for the U.S. Attorney's Office in Cleveland, and for the Justice Department. In the course of that investigation, OSI's staff historians found documents in 4 different countries, I mentioned them before, including the former West Germany, confirming Demjanek's service at Sobibor and other Nazi camps, but not at Treblinka. I recommended re-prosecution of the denaturalization case. I presented the case to then U.S. Attorney General Janet Reno, a very courageous lady, and she approved my recommendation. In May 1999, our new case was filed in District Court in Cleveland with Sobibor service as the heart of the legal complaint. We didn't allege Treblinka service, and it remains my view that the evidence is patently insufficient to support any such allegation. The case went to trial before Judge Mattia in 2001. To our great surprise, in opening arguments, Demjanek's attorney, famed defense lawyer Michael Tygar, largely jettisoned the so-called KGB defense, to which his client had steadfastly clung for more than 20 years. Instead, Tygar suggested that yes, and Ivan Demjanek had served the SS as a guard at the Sobibor extermination camp, but that this person was a cousin of his client, the defendant, who had the same name as John Demjanek, but had stolen his identity. The assertion was absurd, and we had no problem proving its falsity. Judge Mataya later issued a decision revoking, again, Demjanek's U.S. citizenship, which that same judge had restored a few years earlier. Judge Mataya ruled that we had proved that Demjanek had indeed served at Sobibor and that he participated there in, quote, the process by which thousands of Jews were murdered by asphyxiation with carbon monoxide, gas that had been pumped in from a diesel engine, the exhaust from a diesel engine. The impressively documented and well-reasoned federal court decision did not lead Demjanek's supporters to lower the volume of their attacks against the government, much less to abandon them. Let's see if I can find the pictures now. People like Pat Buchanan, Holocaust denier Jerome Brentar, and then Congressman Jim Traficant continued their bellicose broadsides. Here's a screen capture of very young Rosenbaum debating Pat Buchanan on the former CNN program Crossfire. Unfortunately, I'm being double teamed because I've got Robert Novak, an equally pleasant fellow on my left. Traficant, however, did have to cool it for a period of years as he was convicted later in 2002 on federal corruption charges of bribery, tax evasion, and racketeering, was expelled from the House of Representatives on a 420-1 vote. Only California Congressman Gary Condit voted no for some reason, and he went to prison for 7 years. Permit me to interrupt quickly the Demjanek chronology with the story of Pat Buchanan's arguably most outrageous defense of John Demjanek. Years ago, Buchanan devoted one of his syndicated newspaper columns to a presentation of what he considered to be the proof that neither John Demjanek nor anyone else could have murdered Jews in gas chambers in the manner in which it was done at places like Treblinka and Sobibor, namely by pumping the exhaust from a diesel engine into an execution chamber. Employing a proof that we later learned had been devised and published previously by a Holocaust denial rag published in Buchanan's home state of Virginia, he told the story of a group of students, public school students, who were visiting Washington from Pensacola, Florida, years earlier, and had been on a train that got stuck in an Amtrak tunnel underneath Capitol Hill. The train had a diesel-powered locomotive, and for some minutes, diesel exhaust flowed into the train cars. But lo and behold, Buchanan said, none of the students died. Hence, he said, there wasn't enough carbon monoxide in diesel exhaust to kill human beings. I'm sure Doug Neckers could probably do a paper on this. He's a scientist. I'm not. But it fell to me, just to be sure, to run this story down. And I went online and I found this old Washington Post story about this very incident. Sure enough, they got trapped in the tunnel and there was diesel exhaust, and it said that they had been, some of them had become very ill and were taken to Capitol Hill Hospital, and it named the doctor who treated them. He was still there. I called him. He was incredulous to learn what Pat Buchanan had made of this episode. He said, look, these kids had a fairly modest exposure to diesel exhaust. They weren't in a sealed execution chamber. They were in a long tunnel, open at both ends, which permitted almost immediate dissipation of the exhaust. And it was a fairly short period of time. Nonetheless, he said some of them got very, very sick. And then just to be doubly sure, I called the office of the Washington, D.C. medical examiner. And they told me what I expected to hear, namely, that in pricier areas of the nation's capital, there are, with some frequency, sad to say, instances of people who can no longer bear life on this earth, and they have no trouble ending their lives in their garages with the exhaust from their diesel Mercedes, their diesel Volvo, whatever. Over the years, at least when Buchanan is not running for president, and so the Hatch Act doesn't prevent me from speaking of him. I was fond in public appearances of telling this story and making the following offer to Mr. Buchanan. I would traditionally say, notwithstanding my very modest government salary, I will purchase for Mr. Buchanan the diesel automobile of his choice if he will simply demonstrate this novel theory in his own garage. He never took me up on it. Demjanek's appeals consumed many years, but finally they ended and we were able to commence deportation proceedings. Demjanek arrived during one of these proceedings, either denaturalization or deportation, in a wheelchair, by the way. But we noticed that the wheelchair looked brand new. It looked like it had never been used before. And one of our prosecutors, a colleague in Cleveland, saw Demjanek get out of the wheelchair and walk up the stairs in the federal building when he and his family and lawyer didn't realize that anyone could see him. In 2005, we won a deportation order from U.S. Immigration Court in Cleveland. The judge ordered Demjanek removed to Ukraine, Germany, or Poland. Again, Demjanek's lawyers, though, succeeded in dragging out the appeals for years, all of which failed. Before you knew it, we were in 2008. During that year and the following year, all three of those countries, Germany, Ukraine, Poland, refused to accept it, which was consistent, outrageously, with their usual position in the Justice Department's Nazi cases over the decades. We win our cases in court, and then in quite a few of them, we can't get the relief to which we're entitled under the law because the countries of Europe, which have the moral responsibility and sometimes the legal responsibility to take these people back, won't do it, and they stay in the United States. In fact, and they die. In a country whose families sacrificed 200,000 of their precious sons and quite a number of daughters as well to bring an end to the nightmare of Nazi inhumanity. In fact, at that time, one of Demjanek's lawyers, in a phone conversation with me, chuckled as he confidently lectured me that my agency's victory over his client in the courts was a Pyrrhic one, as the U.S. government will never, his word, be able to persuade any country to take Demjanek as a deportee. In my heart, I was convinced that he was right. Demjanek was by now 85 years old. Time was surely running out for us, and we knew we didn't have a good track record of reversing decisions by European countries when they declined to take these people. And then something surprising, and I will say wonderful, happened. We made contact with two dedicated investigative judges in Germany, and we shared our evidence and suggested a legal theory. Our evidence and legal theory turned out to be sufficient for them to build a prosecutable case in Germany, and they recommended to Munich prosecutors that Demjanek be charged with serving as an accessory to thousands of murders of Jews committed at the Silberberg camp. They added one piece of evidence that fit perfectly into the case that we had handed to them on a silver platter. Tracing the names of the other guards who had been listed on that so hard to read 1944 Flossenburg concentration camp SS roster that we had found, they discovered that one of the men, Alexander Nagorny, remember that name? Alexander Nagorny was still alive in Germany, living in the city of Landshut. So it turned out that this man with whom Demjanek, and then they checked old West German residential records, and as I indicated before, they found municipal records showing that Demjanek and Nagorny had shared an apartment after the war in that same city, Landshut. One of the judges then visited Nagorny at his home and interviewed him. Nagorny admitted that he'd served as a guard at the Flossenburg camp. He acknowledged that Ivan Demjanek had served with him there as a guard, and he confirmed that he and Demjanek had shared an apartment in Landshut after the war. We at OSI then found in U.S. military records at the National Archives documentation showing that American occupation authorities in Germany had prosecuted both Nagorny and Demjanek on the same day in 1947 for illegal possession of guns. Demjanek was acquitted, as I recall, and Nagorny may have been convicted. In any event, Demjanek was indicted in Germany on July 13, 2009 and charged with nearly 28,000 counts of accessory to murder. Since he was now wanted in Germany, the federal government in Berlin had no choice but to reverse its decision to decline to admit Demjanek as a deportee. At long last, all obstacles to carrying out Demjanek's deportation were surmounted, or so we thought. By the way, this is Alexander Nagorny in Germany in 2009. Plainly shocked both by the German indictment and by the realization that the US government now could actually carry out their client's removal, Demjanek's lawyers sprung into urgent action. They filed court papers arguing that deporting Demjanek to Germany would violate, get this, US obligations under the Convention Against Torture. You heard me right. They contended that our carrying out Demjanek's deportation to Germany would result in his being tortured. Their argument was that Demjanek was gravely ill, that's why he had to use a wheelchair, and that because he was so ill, putting him aboard an aircraft and flying him across the Atlantic would itself amount to torture. We were dubious of the medical claim, and in any event, the lower courts rejected defense counsel's novel torture argument. Our colleagues at Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the former INS, now ICE, arranged for a medevac plane to carry John Demjanek to Germany to be brought at last to the bar of justice. He would be accompanied on the flight at US taxpayer expense by both a doctor and a nurse, just to be on the safe side. Well, reporters swarmed around Demjanek's Ohio home. They camped out there, and when the ICE agents arrived to take Demjanek to the plane, he moaned loudly, said he certainly couldn't walk, and they carried him out on a stretcher. I'm going to skip the videos, I think, but many of you will remember this scene. They had to carry him out on a stretcher. In photos published throughout the world, Demjanek is shown being carried outside the house, mouth agape, eyes closed, looking like he was on death's doorstep. The ICE agents whisked him to their headquarters building in downtown Cleveland, chased by reporters in cars and in news helicopters. Both CNN and local Cleveland TV interrupted their regular programming to offer live coverage from the air as the ICE vehicle traversed the streets of Cleveland with Demjanek inside. We expected now that our years of hard work would be rewarded within an hour or two with Demjanek being medevaced to Germany. Stunningly, however, our hopes were soon dashed. Demjanek's lawyers won an emergency order from the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals in